Hi everybody. So today we're going to be having a little think about doing some writing. Now yesterday, on Monday, we planned a letter and we were thinking about Jeff. In our class book, there's a boy in the girls' bathroom. Now we're planning a letter as though we're Jeff. So we were thinking about what sort of things he might say in a letter, because we received a letter, didn't we, from his friend Frankie. And Frankie asked him a few questions, didn't he? Hey Jeff, how's it going? What are the guys at your new school like? Have you made any friends? And then also Jeff added at the end, write back, I want to hear all about your new school. So it gave us some prompts for things that Jeff might say in his reply letter. So yesterday we wrote some notes of the sorts of things that Jeff might say. Now I know that you can't see mine very clearly there. I printed it as large as I can really to fit it on, but I'll just keep referring to it as we talk about our letter. So we're going to get started now. Let me grab my pens. So we're going to think about Jeff and his response to Frankie. His friend Frankie's written him a letter. Jeff's going to reply. So the first thing we need to think back now, it was a couple of weeks ago now, we talked about the voice in a letter. We talked about an adult voice and a child voice and how you can tell the difference and how you can recognise who's written a letter by the type of language that they use and the sort of vocabulary that they choose. So for example, a child's letter is going to be much more conversational, especially writing to a friend. It's almost going to be as if they're chatting, isn't it? It's going to be very informal, very conversational. They might use slang, they might use short, simple sentences, they might use punctuation in a slightly different way than you would in a more formal letter. So there's lots of things that we can use today in our letter to show that we are a child writing this letter. Also think about maintaining that voice of our character. Think about Jeff, think about what he's like. And we know that he's the new boy at school. He seems quite quiet, he seems quite timid, and he's had a few little run-ins with Bradley, hasn't he? So he's going to mention those, isn't he, at some point? So we would talk about them, and we're going to think about how we would describe those events. We may even think about our sentence structure slightly. We looked at simple sentences, we looked at compound sentences, where we join two independent clauses. The sun was shining and the weather was clear. Two nice simple sentences joined together with a conjunction. We did talk as well about complex sentences, but if we're writing as a child, we're not necessarily going to use those, are we? Because that's a more grown-up way to write. A child, a sort of an 11, 12-year-old boy like Jeff, who's writing to another 11, 12-year-old boy, isn't going to write in that way. Imagine how you would write a letter to a friend. It would be very informal, very conversational. So let's start to have a think about some of the things we're going to write in our letter. So, to begin with, we're obviously going to start our letter. Now, his friend here is called Frankie. Now, just to get ourselves into that child voice, I've decided I'm going to give him a bit of a nickname. And I'm going to call him Frizzle. Perhaps that's a nickname that Jeff had for him. Hey, Frizzle. So he's calling him Frizzle straight away, which is a much more childlike way to refer to someone, isn't it, in the letter? Using their nickname, using a friendly nickname for them. So our first little section, we're going to have 4 sections to our letter today, is to answer Frankie's question. Hey, Jeff, how's it going? So what's it been like since you moved? How have you settled in? It's those sort of things that we're going to say, isn't it? So my notes here, I've written, not really very good. Started a new school. It's quite strange being in a new town. I feel like everyone's looking at me and I miss you guys. So that's going to be my first section. So I'm going to start here. It's not been great. It's not been great, really. This new school is kind of weird. So there, can you see I've used a kind of a slang term. Kinda isn't a word. It would be kind of. It's kind of weird, but I've used the word kinda, like a child would use. So that's kind of more the sort of vocabulary that a 12-year-old boy is going to use when he's writing to his friend. So it's not been great, really. This new school's kind of weird. And I'm going to mention now about everyone looking at me. Everyone, I'll spell that correctly, that would help. Everyone stares at me. I hate it. And instead of using 1 exclamation mark, I've used 3. He's really emphasising, I hate it. Oh, it's awful. It's the worst thing ever. Capital. And then because he misses his friends, he might not say, you know, being a 12-year-old boy, he might not admit, oh, I really miss you. He might not say it like that, but he might say, wish I was back in Washington, which is where he moved from, if you remember. So rather than saying, you know, I really miss you guys, he might put it as, you know, wish I was back in Washington, showing that he, you know, he wants to be back there. So that's our first section there of our letter covered. It's not been great, really. This new school's kind of weird. Everyone stares at me. I hate it. Wish I was back in Washington. So we'll have a look at our second part there. So, what the guys at your new school like was what Frankie wrote in his letter. So Bradley is going, Jeff is going to reply, and the person that's going to really take up most of his explanation here is going to be Bradley, isn't it? So there's one guy called Bradley. He's super weird. He acts like my friend 1 second, then pretends I don't exist. He threatened me on my first day, if we remember that. Give me $1 or I'll spit on you. And he keeps saying to Jeff, let's go in the girls' bathroom. But Jeff thinks he's kind of weird. He's written there, weirdo. So I'm going to start a new short paragraph. So we're going to have kind of 4 short paragraphs for our letter today. In fact, we're only going to do 2 paragraphs today, and we'll do 2 paragraphs tomorrow, because I want to make sure that we're really concentrating and this is good quality. So we're actually going to only write 2 sections today. So, he's going to talk about Bradley here, isn't he? There's this one guy, in brackets, he might put his name, Bradley. Now that, if you remember, earlier on last week we talked about parentheses, didn't we, and adding little bits of information. So in the brackets there, we've just given the name of this one guy that he's referring to. So this one guy, Bradley. There's this one guy, Bradley, who, and he's kind of hung around with him, hasn't he? So he might say who I've, can you use that word kinda again? Who I've kind of hung out with, full stop. He's a bit strange. I'm going to say a bit weird. He's a bit weird! Exclamation mark. You know, he's a bit weird. Some days he's nice, and some days, not spelled that correctly, hold on one second. Some days he's horrible. Now I'm going to mention that incident on the first day where he threatened him. So I'm just going to kneel down so I can write a bit more neatly. On my first day, comma, because I've got a kind of adverbial opener there. On my first day, a time adverbial, comma. He threatened to spit on me. Who does that? Freak. So, I've used some kind of informal sentence types down the bottom here as well. So let's have a read through of my letter. I can see there that as it gets further down, my pen's running out a little bit, but I think we can just about see it okay. So, hey Frizzle, it's not been great really. This new school's kind of weird. Everyone stares at me. I hate it. Wish I was back in Washington. There's this one guy, Bradley, who I've kind of hung out with. He's a bit weird. Some days he's nice and some days he's horrible. On my first day, he threatened to spit on me. Who does that? Freak. So he's mentioning Bradley and he's talking about Bradley, isn't he, in particular in that section. And can you see I've used lots of kind of informal conversational language. I've used the word kinda. Instead of saying, you know, that somebody's strange, I've said they're weird. I've used punctuation differently. You know, we would never use 3 exclamation marks, but I have there. I hate it. It's really emphasising. I hate it. I could even, I've changed it, and I could, I'm just going to rub out, I could use, which we would never normally do, but he might, I might even change it to all capitals. You know, he might say it like that, I hate it. He's emphasising just how much he hates it. Wish I was back in Washington. There's this one guy, Bradley, so I use brackets there to put his name in, a little bit of parentheses if you remember, who I've kind of hung out with. He's a bit weird. Some days he's nice. I've spelt he's wrong there, so I'll have to correct that. Really important that we correct as we go along. Got the contraction, he's for he is. Some days he's nice and some days he's horrible. On my first day, he threatened to spit on me. Who does that? Freak. So the main thing that I've really tried to do today is to write in the style of Jeff and how he would speak as a 12-year-old boy. So I've used slang. I haven't used any complex sentences that we've talked about because a child wouldn't write using complex sentences. He would use more simple sentences, simple vocabulary. He might use slang, like the word kinda, which I used a couple of times. I used it there, kinda weird, kinda, and, you know, I've kind of hung out with. That's a very kind of childlike thing. Rather than I've kind of been friends with or I've been spending time with, I hung out with. So I'm using these more childlike ways of explaining things so that I'm maintaining the voice of Jeff. I want the reader to read this letter and know, oh, that's definitely a child that wrote that letter, because that's what we're aiming to do, isn't it? We're aiming to show Jeff in our letter. So there's the first two sections. We'll have another look tomorrow at our plan again, and we'll think about the last two sections of our letter so that we've got a completed letter. So think about today. Here's your key list of things to think about. Think about the voice of the character. How will the reader know that this is a child writing this letter? So think about the sort of things that you would say. You're a child. You're in the perfect position to think about, well, how would I write to my friend? What vocabulary would I use? How would I speak to them in a letter? Think about the things that Jeff would say. What's he going to talk about and how's he going to talk about, particularly when it comes to Bradley. You know, he's called him a weirdo here and a freak because Bradley's acted in a very strange way towards him, hasn't he? So think about the voice of the character, think about what he would say, and think about that conversational style of letter. It's almost as if he's talking to him, not writing him a formal letter. It's like he's chatting really as he writes. He's chatting away. And you might also use some slang language in there as well to keep that child voice going. Okay, so I'll step out the way and you can pause the video and you can keep that on screen if you want, and it'll help you to think about the sort of things you're going to use in your letter, and you've got your plan. So for today, I just want those first two sections of your letter written, okay? So pause the video now and you can keep that on screen.